The auction yard sat beneath a leaden sky, its bleachers half empty, its air thick with the dust of yesterday's storms and the tired shouts of men trying to wring money out of broken animals. Somewhere past the rusted gates and the muddied trailers, a gaunt horse stood tethered to a post, ribs showing through his damp coat, head hanging low like he'd already accepted the sentence he hadn't yet heard. No one looked at him twice, except for Elijah. He stood at the edge of the crowd, hood up, coat frayed at the sleeves, hands buried deep in threadbare pockets. The cold didn't seem to bother him, nor the way people gave him space like his poverty might be contagious. His boots were soaked through, his beard untrimmed, and his face carried that quiet, distant look of a man who'd once had everything he needed and then lost it one piece at a time. Beside him, a mother tugged her child away, whispering something about not staring. Elijah didn't notice. His eyes were locked on the dun-colored horse tied to the post like forgotten baggage. There were better-looking animals in the ring, glossy, muscled stallions, mares with lineage printed on laminated signs. But Elijah couldn't look away from the one nobody wanted. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the air, sharp and relentless. Lot 32, 2-year-old filly, strong legs, saddle-trained. Who'll start me off at 1,000? A murmur, a few raised hands. Numbers flew, fast as crows, and the hammer dropped. Another horse. Another number. The rejected one outside hadn't even made it into the ring yet. A man in a tan coat approached Elijah, glancing him up and down before curling his lip. "You lost, buddy." Elijah said nothing. "Look," the man continued, "you can't hang around here unless you're bidding. You're scaring off customers." "I'm watching the horse," Elijah replied quietly, nodding toward the post. The man snorted. "That sack of bones. He's going to slaughter. Not worth the hay it takes to feed him." Elijah's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He only stepped around the man and walked slowly to the fence, hands gripping the wood. The horse lifted its head for just a moment, eyes hollow, motionless, before returning to its downward gaze. Elijah exhaled like he'd been holding something inside for years, something deeper than breath. The next hour passed in bursts of noise and silence, hooves and hammers. Horses were led in and out. Some resisted, some obeyed. Money changed hands. The dun horse remained forgotten, save for the occasional glance from a worker who looked increasingly irritated that the creature hadn't yet been hauled away. When the bidding slowed and the crowd thinned, the auctioneer sighed and cleared his throat. "Last up, lot 48. Unbroken gelding. 5 years, no papers. We'll open at $50. Laughter. One man in the crowd hollered, "50? You should pay us to take him." More chuckles. The horse was led in, ribs like piano keys under dull skin, one ear bent the wrong way, and a limp in his left hind leg. The worker leading him kept the rope tight and the whip ready. But the horse didn't fight. He just stumbled forward like something inside had already given up. "Do I hear 50? The auctioneer tried again, voice tired. Silence. Elijah stepped forward. "I'll take him." It wasn't loud, but in the lull it echoed. Heads turned. Whispers started. The auctioneer peered through the crowd. "Who said that?" Elijah lifted his hand. The man in the tan coat barked, "You gotta be kidding me. This guy, he's not buying anything." "I've got the money," Elijah said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a folded wad of bills, creased, old, but real. 50. In cash. The auctioneer shrugged. "Sold." The gavel fell. Elijah stepped under the railing, walking toward the horse. The worker looked at him like he was some kind of ghost. "You sure? He's not right." "I'm sure." He took the lead rope gently. The horse didn't flinch, just stood there, breathing slow, eyes unreadable. Elijah looked him over, noting the scar on his shoulder, the cracked hooves, the way his coat bristled from neglect. Then he said softly, "Come on, partner. Let's get you home." The word home tasted foreign in his mouth. As he led the horse away, the man in the tan coat called out behind him, "What are you going to do with that wreck? You planning to eat him or bury him?" Elijah didn't answer. He walked the horse down the gravel road toward an old truck parked near the edge of the lot, a rusted-out Ford with one working headlight and a trailer that had seen better decades. He opened the ramp and waited. The horse hesitated, one hoof halfway up, then froze. Elijah didn't push. He just stood beside him and whispered, "It's all right. Take your time." It took 7 minutes. 7 minutes of silence, wind, and patient stillness before the horse stepped up, one leg, then the next. Elijah closed the ramp gently and latched it shut. He climbed into the truck, turned the key, and the engine sputtered like it might refuse. But then it caught. The drive back to his place took nearly 2 hours, over cracked roads and under lowering skies. Rain tapped on the windshield. He didn't turn on the radio. At a bend in the road, where the pavement turned to dirt, a broken sign read Briar Hollow. Just beyond it, Elijah's land stretched out. 10 acres of rough pasture, a leaning barn, and a sagging cabin that looked like it was waiting for someone to give it a reason not to collapse. He backed the trailer beside the barn and opened it. The horse stood still. Elijah climbed in, laid a hand on the gelding's neck, and whispered again, "You're all right. We're here now." This time the horse stepped down without coaxing. Inside the barn, he cleared out a stall, laid fresh straw, filled a trough with water from the hand pump. The horse drank like it was the first water he'd trusted in weeks. Elijah watched, then sat down on an overturned bucket just outside the stall, hands resting on his knees. Rain began to fall harder, hitting the roof in loud bursts, but he didn't move. "Guess we both got thrown away," he murmured. The horse didn't respond, but he turned slowly and looked at Elijah for a long, silent moment before settling into the straw with a heavy, wheezing sigh. Later, after the storm passed, Elijah went inside the cabin. It was sparse, 1 chair, 1 bed, a stove that only worked when kicked twice. He opened a tin of beans and sat by the window, watching the barn through the foggy glass. He hadn't planned to buy a horse, hadn't planned much of anything lately. Life had taken the wheel some time ago and driven it into a ditch. But something about that animal had struck a note deep in him. Maybe it was the eyes. Maybe the silence. He didn't even know the horse's name. Maybe tomorrow he'd figure it out. That night, he dreamed of hooves pounding across open fields, of a barn filled with light, of a second chance galloping toward him like something wild and impossible. He awoke just before dawn. In the gray morning stillness, he stood by the stall again, watching the horse breathe. "You made it through the night," he said softly. The horse flicked one ear, then the other. Elijah smiled just a little. So did I. And though neither of them knew it yet, everything had just begun. The wind had changed by morning. It no longer smelled of rain and rot, but of brittle hay and the distant promise of frost. Elijah stood outside the barn with a battered tin cup, sipping coffee that tasted like smoke and sleep. Inside, the horse, still nameless, shifted slowly in his stall, the straw rustling under hooves that still favored the left hind. Elijah had spent the night cataloging what little he had to offer the creature. 1 rusted curry comb, a half-used bag of feed that had been meant for chickens he no longer kept, and his own 2 hands, rough but steady. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. The sun rose slow, painting the frostbitten pasture in copper hues. Elijah opened the stall and stepped inside, careful not to crowd the gelding. "You're still breathing," he said softly. "Good." The horse blinked at him, his breath steaming in the cold. His eyes weren't glassy anymore. They weren't alive, not yet, but they noticed. Elijah held out the curry comb, not touching him yet, just letting him see it. "This isn't going to hurt. I'll go easy." For several minutes, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the horse turned his head away, not with fear, but with reluctant permission. Elijah began at the shoulder, brushing in careful, rhythmic strokes. Dried mud flaked off in pieces, and under the grime was skin stretched tight over bone. Each stroke revealed just how far gone the horse had been allowed to fall. "You've got a long road ahead, partner," Elijah murmured. The horse shifted but didn't flinch. Over the next week, a routine emerged. At sunrise, Elijah fed him, half rations stretched carefully, and cleaned the stall. He spoke to the horse as he worked, never asking anything in return. He didn't try to ride him, didn't even put a halter on. By day 4, the gelding followed him loosely from stall to pasture, dragging one hoof with a slow determination. Elijah watched him move, noting the limp. Old injury, likely untreated. It would heal crooked, but it would heal. Still, the horse didn't eat much. Just enough to survive. "You've got to want it," Elijah said one night, standing beside him in the pasture as dusk swallowed the sky. "I can't do the living for you." The horse stood like a statue, head low, the wind tugging at his mane. That night, Elijah dug through a box buried in the back of the cabin. Inside were faded photographs, a weathered saddle blanket, and a leather halter with the name Dusty etched into the brass plate. Not this horse's name, but one that had mattered once. He placed the halter on the barn wall and left it there like an altar. By the 10th day, the gelding walked without stumbling. He didn't trust easily, wouldn't take food from Elijah's hand, but he no longer shrank from his presence. There was recognition in his eyes now, and wariness, like he'd been fooled before. Elijah knew the look. He'd worn it himself once, long after his brother stopped calling and his mother's letters came back marked return to sender. Life had a way of withdrawing promises. One morning, while cleaning the water trough, Elijah spoke aloud without thinking. "Name ought to mean something, I figure. Can't just call you horse forever." The gelding stood under the barn's awning, chewing hay slowly. "Something strong," Elijah continued. "Not fancy. Just earned." He thought for a while, staring at the scar on the horse's shoulder. It looked like a burn. Old, mean, deliberate. "Bran," he said finally. "Short for branded. But not broken." The horse flicked his ears. Elijah smiled. "Bran it is." That afternoon, he placed the halter, cleaned and softened with oil, on Bran's head. The horse froze at first, then let it happen. No fight, no retreat, just stillness and consent. They began groundwork the next morning. Elijah moved slow, walking Bran in wide circles, teaching him to respond to shifts in pressure and voice. At first, Bran resisted, not violently, just with confusion and deep-seated mistrust. He didn't understand kindness without demand. But day by day, the mistrust bent. Never broke, just bent a little further. One night, as they walked the perimeter of the pasture under a crescent moon, Elijah stopped and touched the horse's neck gently. "You're learning to stay," he said. "That's something." Bran leaned into the touch, just for a moment. Then came the truck. It arrived 2 weeks after the auction. A new Ford, shiny and black, tires too clean to have ever touched real dirt. The man who stepped out wore a suit that didn't belong anywhere near horses. His boots were polished, his tie straight, his expression a smirk carved from marble. Elijah recognized him instantly. Gordon Wyatt. He'd run one of the biggest breeding operations in the county before it went belly up. Rumors said he'd cut corners, used sedatives, pushed colts too young, sent the weak ones to slaughter. Elijah hadn't seen him in years. Not since Dusty died. Not since Wyatt offered to buy the land Elijah couldn't afford to keep. "Still clinging to this dump, huh?" Wyatt called, arms spread like he was arriving for a photo shoot. "Heard you picked up a reject at the sale. Figured I'd stop by and see the miracle horse." Elijah didn't move from the porch. "He's not for sale." Wyatt smiled wider. "Everything's for sale." "No, it ain't." Wyatt paced toward the pasture, spotting Bran under the tree line. "That's the one," he scoffed. "Hell, I sold that sack of bones to the yard myself. Thought he was glue by now." Elijah's spine stiffened. "Why'd you get rid of him?" "Wouldn't run. Wouldn't breed. Stupid beast, just stood there like a statue. Waste of feed. I gave him 3 chances, more than most. You're welcome, by the way." Elijah stepped down from the porch, jaw tight. "You don't belong here." Wyatt shrugged. "I'll be back. When the bank finally pries this place out of your hands, I'll be first in line. You're just playing cowboy on borrowed time." He got in the truck and drove off, the engine coughing dust into the air. Elijah stood there long after the sound faded, fists clenched at his sides. That night, he couldn't sleep. Bran stood by the fence near the house, eyes watching the dark. Elijah sat on the porch, turning Wyatt's words over in his head like stones in a boot. He didn't have much, but he had enough for now. And Bran was starting to believe again. The next morning, Bran waited at the gate when Elijah came out. He didn't nudge, didn't beg, just stood there solid, like a question hanging in the cold air. Elijah grabbed the saddle blanket. "Time to see what you remember." Bran stood still as Elijah placed it across his back. No flinch. No step away. The saddle came next. He moved slow, speaking soft. Bran shifted but didn't bolt. Then the bridle. Then the mounting block. Elijah climbed up, easing weight into the stirrups. Bran tensed beneath him, the muscle in his neck tight as wire. For a second, Elijah thought he might buck, or rear, or fall to the ground. But Bran stood, trembling, breathing hard, but standing. Elijah didn't press, didn't ask for motion, just sat there, one hand on the horn, the other on Bran's neck. "You did it," he whispered. He dismounted just as slowly. Bran shook once, like shaking off a ghost. The next day, they took their first steps together. By the 5th day, they were trotting. By the end of the week, Bran was carrying him down the fence line with the grace of a horse who'd never been broken, only bruised. Elijah knew better than to hope too soon. But hope had a way of creeping in, silent and persistent. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Elijah spotted tire tracks in the dirt. Fresh ones. And something else. A slip of paper nailed to the fence. A legal notice. Thick with print. The land was under lien. He crumpled it in his fist. Behind him, Bran nickered softly, stepping close. Elijah didn't look back. They'd come too far to lose it now. Elijah stood at the edge of his pasture, the lien notice clenched in his hand like a dying leaf. The paper had no emotion, no heart, just cold, printed language, numbers he couldn't pay, and dates that came too fast. The bank wasn't interested in horses or healing. They wanted signatures. And silence. Bran nudged his shoulder gently, ears forward, eyes searching. The horse had changed. In just weeks, his coat had regained its sheen, his ribs had softened with muscle, and his eyes no longer looked hollowed out by betrayal. But it wasn't just his body that had returned. It was something deeper, something quiet and solid. "You don't owe me anything," Elijah said softly, stroking the horse's neck. "I didn't bring you here to carry my burdens." Bran leaned into the touch. It was the closest thing to a promise either of them had ever made. Later that afternoon, Elijah drove into town, boots dusty, hat low, the lien folded in his coat pocket. He stopped at the feed store and asked for work. The mechanic's shop, the diner where he once washed dishes for a place to sit. No hours left. They all said, "Not for now." "Sorry, Eli." He nodded each time, polite, even grateful. He didn't expect much from people anymore. But the silence on the way home felt heavier than ever. He passed the auction yard on the way back, gravel crunching under his tires. The gate was locked, the yard empty. But he sat there for a long time, staring at the ring, remembering Bran's eyes that first day, dull, defeated, nearly gone. Something stirred behind the window of the auction office. A face peered out, then the door creaked open. Jasper Holloway, the old auctioneer, stepped out holding a mug of coffee and a half-curious expression. "Elijah Kane," he called. "That you?" Elijah stepped out of the truck and nodded. "Thought you'd disappeared. Last I heard, you walked out of here with a horse and half the town whispering you'd lost your mind." Elijah shrugged. "Maybe I had." Jasper chuckled. "Well, if you did, it worked. That horse is still alive." "Better than alive," Elijah said. "He's back." Jasper sipped his coffee and studied him. "You got a minute?" They sat in the office, surrounded by calendars, ledgers, and the scent of old coffee and pine cleaner. Jasper set the mug down and leaned forward. "I've been thinking about restarting the fall showcase," he said. "Used to be the biggest event in the county before folks stopped caring about horses and started caring more about machines. Couldn't get entries the last couple years. But people need stories again. Something real." Elijah tilted his head. "What's that got to do with me?" "I want you to ride that horse. Show him. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just honest. People remember when something's true." Elijah hesitated. He's not a show horse. Don't want a show horse. Want a survivor. If he can trot and listen, that's enough. Might even stir up some goodwill. A fundraiser, maybe. For you. For others like you. What do you say? Elijah looked out the window, the sky growing gold with evening. He's got one ride in him, if it's the right one. The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. The lean deadline loomed closer. 30 days left, but Elijah had no time to dwell. He trained Bran every day at dawn and again before dusk, not with harshness, but with patience, shaping trust into motion. They practiced patterns in the pasture, worked on leads and circles, and introduced small obstacles. Elijah didn't push for speed. He asked for steadiness. The horse gave more than he took. By the time the showcase arrived, Bran was ready in the only way that mattered. The event drew a larger crowd than expected. Old cowboys came from neighboring counties. Children pressed against the rails. Local vendors set up booths selling lemonade, pies, and handmade rope. And Gordon Wyatt stood near the announcer's booth, arms folded, eyes cold. "He's here," Elijah muttered, brushing Bran's mane one last time behind the barn. "He's always watching," Jasper said behind him. But today, so is everyone else. The sun was high when Elijah led Bran into the ring. The crowd hushed. There was no fancy gear, just a clean saddle, oiled leather, and a man who rode with the weight of his failures and his faith in every quiet command. Bran stepped lightly. He didn't prance or strut, just moved with intention. His limp was faint now, more memory than wound. Elijah guided him in slow, deliberate turns. A weave through barrels. A pause. A turn on the forehand. Nothing flashy. Just partnership. Midway through the pattern, a tarp flapped near the fence. Bran spooked sideways, eyes wide. Elijah didn't jerk the reins. He spoke low, steady. "It's all right. I'm here." Bran breathed once, deep and long, and settled. They finished the pattern in silence. When Elijah dismounted, the crowd rose to their feet, not in thunderous applause, but in something more meaningful. Respect. Recognition. Jasper handed him a microphone. Elijah looked at the people, then at Bran, who stood calm and unafraid. "This horse was thrown away," he said. "They said he wasn't worth keeping. I know what that feels like. I was a man without anything. No family, no money, no land I could truly hold. But this horse didn't need riches. He needed someone to wait with him, to listen, to not ask too much." He paused, his voice soft. "We both came back from something. And maybe that's all this world needs right now, a reason to believe that broken things still have value." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Then someone clapped. Then another. Then the whole arena filled with sound. Not just hands, but hearts. By evening, the auction office had collected donations from more than 50 people. Jasper handed Elijah a ledger with the final tally. "It's enough," he said quietly, "to keep your land, to start again." Elijah stared at the number, the weight of it hitting him in slow waves. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't," Jasper replied. "Just ride. Outside." Gordon Wyatt approached with that familiar sneer. "Cute speech," he said. "You won today, Kane. But charity dries up. Don't get used to applause." Elijah stepped closer, his voice low. "You had your chance with Bran. You saw a problem. I saw a partner." Wyatt scoffed and turned away. Bran lifted his head as Wyatt passed, eyes sharp, unmoved. He didn't flinch. Back at the barn, Elijah unsaddled Bran slowly. The horse leaned into him, warm and solid. "You did good," Elijah said. "Better than good." The wind rustled the trees above, carrying the scent of cedar and rain. Elijah looked around the land, the fences mended, the grass returning, the barn standing with its old bones, but new purpose. He was no longer a man waiting to lose. Bran lifted his head toward the rising stars, nostrils flaring like he could smell something distant and alive. Elijah followed his gaze. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was only the beginning. The days that followed the showcase were filled with quiet victories. Neighbors who once passed by without a glance now waved. A young girl from town brought Elijah a drawing of Bran, crayon lines capturing the proud arch of the horse's neck and the calm in his eyes. Elijah pinned it above his workbench like a talisman. Bran's presence transformed the land. The pasture grew greener. The barn, once slouching under its own weight, stood straighter after Elijah spent days hammering and replacing beams. He did it all with a renewed sense of belonging, not just to the land, but to life. One morning, while repairing a loose board on the north fence, Elijah spotted a truck parked by the main road. It was an expensive model, jet black with polished rims that caught the sun like a blade. A man stepped out wearing a pressed shirt, sunglasses, and a smirk Elijah had hoped never to see again. Gordon Wyatt walked up the dirt path like he owned it. "Morning, Kane," he called, brushing dust from his sleeve. "Heard you managed to weasel your way into keeping this place. Quite the miracle." Elijah dropped the hammer into the grass and leaned against the fence. "I didn't weasel anything. People helped. Something I guess you wouldn't understand." Wyatt smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Charity's cute, but it runs dry faster than a summer creek. And I'm here because I have an offer." "Not interested." "You haven't heard it yet." "Still not interested." Wyatt's grin tightened. "I'm offering more than money. I'm offering permanence. I've got buyers coming in from out of state. Investors. They're looking for property. And this land's got potential, especially with that comeback story floating around. I could make you part of something bigger." "I've been part of something bigger. It was called losing everything." Wyatt stepped closer. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You're riding high now. But let's be honest, this won't last. That horse of yours? One injury away from the glue factory. And when that happens, all this," he gestured to the fields, the barn, the distant hills, "won't mean a damn thing." Bran appeared over the ridge at that moment, trotting down toward the fence, his coat gleaming like bronze in the sun. Wyatt watched him, then turned back to Elijah. "Think it over. I'll be in town for the week. After that, the offer disappears." He walked back to the truck without waiting for a reply. That night, Elijah sat on the porch with Bran grazing nearby. The stars overhead were scattered and bright, and the air smelled of pine and old earth. He felt the pressure again, the weight of uncertainty pressing in despite all he had reclaimed. He didn't sleep. At dawn, Elijah saddled Bran and rode into the hills. He needed clarity. The wind-up there was different, sharper, freer. Bran moved like a creature unburdened by the past, sure-footed and attentive, ears flicking back to catch Elijah's breathing. They stopped by an outcrop overlooking the valley. Elijah dismounted and sat on a flat rock. The land stretched out below like a painting, fences like brushstrokes, the barn like a forgotten signature. "What if he's right?" he said aloud. Bran pawed at the dirt, then stood still, his body calm. Elijah stared at the horizon. "You gave me a second chance, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep it." A voice interrupted the quiet. "Then maybe you need help." Elijah turned sharply. A woman on horseback emerged from the trail behind him. She wore a worn denim jacket and carried herself with quiet confidence. Her horse, a dapple gray mare, stood tall beside Bran without flinching. "Didn't mean to startle you," she said. "Name's Tessa. I was at the showcase." Elijah nodded slowly. "I remember. You rode a paint. Fast and focused." She smiled. "That's the one. Heard you were still out here. Thought I'd drop by. I've been looking for someone like you. Like me. A man who understands what it means to start over. I'm building something, rehabilitation and rescue. Horses and humans, both. I've got a small plot down near Silver Creek, but I need a partner. Someone steady. Someone who doesn't run." Elijah studied her. She wasn't bluffing. There was a strength in her posture, in her words. "I've already got land to worry about," he said, "and a horse that needs me." "Not instead of," she replied. Alongside, they rode back slowly, side by side, talking about everything and nothing. By the time they reached the gate, the sun was high, and Elijah felt lighter. Over the next few days, she came back, sometimes to help repair fences, sometimes just to ride. Bran and her mare became accustomed to each other, their energies complementary, and Elijah began to imagine a different kind of future, one not weighed down by survival, but lifted by connection. But Gordon Wyatt hadn't left town. One afternoon, Elijah returned from the south pasture to find Bran gone. The gate to his enclosure was open, rope dangling from the post. Panic surged. He searched for hours, calling, tracking prints. The sun dipped low, shadows growing long. Finally, near the tree line, he saw it. Hoof marks leading into the back of a trailer parked near the edge of the Wyatt property line. He climbed the gate without hesitation. Wyatt stood by the trailer, arms folded, waiting. "He's not yours," Elijah said, voice shaking with fury. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I don't see any brand. No papers filed. Technically, he's still a stray. I'm just protecting community property." "You're stealing him." "Proving a point," Wyatt replied. "You think a horse is enough to make you a man again? He's just a tool, Kane, and tools get replaced." Bran kicked the side of the trailer with a violent thud, rattling the metal. Elijah stepped forward. "I've fought for that horse harder than you've ever fought for anything in your life. You want to destroy something because you can't stand seeing it stand tall without you." Wyatt's eyes narrowed. "You touch that latch," he said, "and I'll press charges. Trespassing. Theft. Maybe more." Behind him, a horn blared. Tessa's truck pulled up, tires screeching, her voice cutting through the tension. "Already called the sheriff," she said, "and I've got photos. That gate wasn't broken, it was opened, which makes this kidnapping, equine or not." Wyatt's face blanched. Within 20 minutes, a deputy arrived. Wyatt tried to spin the story, but the officer didn't buy it, especially not after seeing Bran's registration papers, which Elijah had finally filed after the showcase, something Jasper had advised him to do, just in case. Bran was released. Wyatt was warned, and Elijah realized, as he walked the horse home with Tessa by his side, that survival was no longer enough. He wanted something more, something permanent. By the time they reached the barn, dusk had wrapped the land in violet and gold. Elijah turned to her. "You really think we could build something together?" Tessa looked around. "I don't just think it. I see it." Elijah opened the stall and let Bran in. The horse turned once, then leaned into his side, breathing slow and even. Elijah smiled. This time, he wasn't just rebuilding a life. He was living it.